Hello there! Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video where I took a look at all of the Fatal Frame games running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Syphon Filter game on the Steam Deck. If you're new to this series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC, and then record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each port a compatibility score out of 10 before issuing a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Each port also needs to render at the deck's native resolution. Lastly, I'll be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus. It's worth mentioning that these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I do want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on the deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing through Steam OS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. There's a very big drum that I repeatedly bang on this channel regarding the changing nature of the games industry and how I feel as though things have gotten steadily worse since the end of the 1990s. Without getting too in the weeds on that particular topic, I need only direct your attention toward Bend Studios' Syphon Filter, a game you have almost certainly seen but never actually played. Or at least that's been my experience up until the making of this video. To wrap back to my initial point, the end of the 90s gave us a suite of new franchises that have since become household names. Some I've even covered for the series, like Silent Hill. It speaks to the sheer variety within the AAA space during that time that a game like Syphon Filter could just slip through the cracks, even though it ticks a heck of a lot of boxes that I like to see get a tickin'. So, righting the wrong of effectively ignoring the franchise for the guts of a quarter century, I tentatively stepped into the shoes of the game's cinderblock-looking protagonist Gabe Logan, not really knowing what to expect. Thematically, Syphon Filter sits somewhere between Metal Gear Solid, Deus Ex and Die Hard. It's woefully over the top, takes itself way too seriously, and it's an absolute riot, not in spite of those factors, but because of them. Right from the off, the game's narrative moves at an absolute breakneck pace. The opening CG cutscene is short, and yet we see like 3 or 4 different countries. There's a cover-up and a virus, Washington.jpg. Once you're handed control, Syphon Filter is primarily a third-person shooter, although sometimes it does decide to be a stealth game. The real value of revisiting a game like this now is the novelty associated with its mechanics. There's no cover system here, no twin stick control. It's entirely bespoke, as the developers were charting new territory before Halo came along and f***ed everything up. You move with the left stick, however you strafe with the triggers, and when you do, Gabe sort of shifts his weight in a really satisfying way. It feels tactile, if a little sluggish by today's standards. You lock onto enemies with R1, and your likelihood of hitting them with your current weapon is shown via the target meter in the upper left hand corner of the screen. Crouching and not running around the place like an idiot will increase your accuracy. However, it also makes you an easier target, which is denoted by the danger meter. Once that bar fills up, enemies will start scoring hits on you quickly and effectively. Thanks to its often punishing combat difficulty and slightly esoteric puzzles, Syphon Filter is definitely a game that benefits from the modern convenience of online walkthroughs and save states. One of its key strengths, however, is its level design. For the most part, Syphon Filter takes place in ordinary places like Washington and a museum. For the most part, these locales are designed much like real-world normal locations. This lends a degree of believability that, despite the blocky visuals and massively over-the-top plot, did ultimately pull me in more than anticipated. To sum up, Syphon Filter is very much a case of what's old is now new again. Practically every third-person shooter out there these days feels chronically over-familiar. The fact that Syphon's mechanics somehow feel fresh in modern year is testament to A, how utterly stagnant the genre is on a core mechanical level these days, and B, how much enjoyment we can still squeeze out of creaky-ass old games. Kicking off our testing for this episode then, and we're running the original Syphon Filter through DuckStation, emudeck's included PS1 emulator. Syphon Filter was only ever released on the original PlayStation, so there's a lot of pressure on DuckStation to provide a playable experience here on the deck. I'm pleased to report that thanks to the emulator's excellent level of compatibility and its overall optimization, Syphon Filter runs flawlessly on the Steam Deck. The game isn't very long, only clocking in around 3 to 4 hours or so, and I was able to complete the entire thing in 2 sittings on the deck without so much as a single performance blip or unexpected deviation to visuals or audio. Controls felt responsive and crisp, however, there is one issue I did run into during my time with the game, and it's more a product of emudeck's configuration than of DuckStation or SteamOS itself. In Syphon Filter, you quick switch through your weapons by hitting the select button, and you can open up a scrollable inventory slider by holding the select button and pressing the triggers to manually peruse your toolset. Anyone who has played a PS1 game via emudeck's install of DuckStation knows that this button combo is actually a built-in hotkey that can be fiddly to unbind. By default, holding the select button and the right trigger fast forwards any game you play within the emulator, and holding the left trigger in combination with select rewinds your game if you have rewinding enabled. This obviously clashes somewhat with Syphon Filter's built-in control scheme. However, it wasn't really a game-breaking issue. I don't have rewinding enabled within DuckStation, so I just made a mental note to use select and the left trigger whenever I wanted to browse my inventory. Easy peasy. Outside of its excellent audio, performance, and general compatibility, DuckStation also lets you do cool stuff with shaders, which come bundled within the emulator so long as you're installing it via emudeck. Here's a CRT shader. Old. In summary then, Syphon Filter is essentially perfect on the Steam Deck. Excellent performance, clean audio, crisp controls, and perfect presentation net the game a flawless 10 out of 10 compatibility rating on Steam Deck. A strong recommendation to kick off the episode. Nice. Thanks to the original game's breakout success, it wouldn't take long for a sequel to emerge from Bend Studio, who I should mention went by the name Idotech at this stage in their journey as a studio. Almost a year to the date after the first game's release, Syphon Filter 2 was assembled and launched for the original PlayStation in March of 2000, during what would come to be the console's autumnal years. In somewhat of an inversion to the praise that I was so keen to give to the first game's refreshing uniqueness, Syphon Filter 2 is a sequel in the most traditional sense, as in, they literally made more levels and then they stuck a 2 on the box. Don't get me wrong, everything you could possibly like about the first game is still here. It just feels like an expansion to Syphon Filter, as opposed to a true iteration of the formula. At the time, critics honed in on this as a negative, and although it's something we're well used to these days, the one-to-one reuse of mechanics, UI elements, and general atmosphere stood out more in the year 2000. Coming back to the game nowadays, I've very little to complain about, to be honest. Syphon Filter 2 is about as short as the first game, so realistically you could very easily play both of them back to back and just treat them as one game. As I played through the second game, I felt in no way fatigued of the series' emerging formula. As I said previously, the moveset and feel of Syphon Filter feels so different to practically everything else out there that it still manages to justify its existence 24 years later. About the only real negatives I could level at the sequel are that the stealth sequences featuring Gabe's partner Leanne are a bit of a fiddly headache, and that the game's overall difficulty curves upward in a pretty dramatic way towards the end of the game. But again, save states. We love them. But do we love Syphon Filter 2 on the Steam Deck? As was the case with the first game, we're running it via DuckStation within SteamOS. And yeah, this is essentially perfect too. Image quality, controls, visuals, I can't really fault the standard of emulation at all here. DuckStation benefits from a really solid base level of compatibility, and it's extremely scalable to even super low-end hardware. The Steam Deck is not low-end by handheld standards, but it would be considered weak next to, say, a high-powered PC for instance. Nevertheless, DuckStation is still capable of handing in an excellent rendition of the game on deck. In fact, the only minor annoyance in Syphon Filter 2's case is that it's a 2-disc game, meaning we need to hop into DuckStation's quick menu and change our disc when prompted. Granted, it's a lot easier than getting out of your chair as we would have had to do back in the old days, so stop complaining, me. Pitch perfect audio, responsive controls, and all of the positives previously handed to the first Syphon Filter are once again dished out for Syphon Filter 2. This merits a back-to-back 10 out of 10 compatibility rating on the Steam Deck, which I believe is a first for this series of videos. Well done to Sony, Bend Studios, Idetech, DuckStation, Valve, and the Steam Deck's touchpads for allowing this to happen. By the time 2001 rolled around, all eyes were locked onto the recently released PlayStation 2 and its newfound foothold as the media and gaming centerpiece of the new millennium. The original PlayStation had a good run, a great one in fact. Even so, the vast majority of Sony's first and second party development partners had shifted their efforts to new projects targeting this new hardware standard. Not Bend Studio, however, who were instead tasked with putting out a third Syphon Filter game for the outgoing PlayStation. A curious choice given the team's well-established technical proficiency and design talent. Nevertheless, Syphon Filter 3 launched for the PS1 in November of 2001, and it's a very strange game. For starters, yeah, it's still essentially the same game as Syphon Filters 1 and 2. Same UI, same mechanics, same, well, everything really. Instead of meaningfully advancing the gameplay at Syphon Filter 3's core, Bend instead opted to put more effort into the game's story, which seems like an utterly odd decision overall. Sure, if the game was being produced for the PlayStation 2, then I could appreciate this newfound focus, but it wasn't. In-game visuals are marginally improved this time around, and that's being generous. The character models in cutscenes though, well, they've seen an enormous jump in fidelity. This is all well and good, but it still would have paled in comparison to what the PS2 was putting out at that time. Most of Syphon Filter 3's missions centre around flashbacks, cataloguing the past exploits of Gabe and his colleagues. Look, I'm sorry, but who cares? I'm sure there are those of you out there that adore Syphon Filter's story, but to me it's always been a pretty loose motivator. Something that's intended to get you from one mission to the next. It's entertaining, but it's more akin to chewing gum than an actual meal. Now look, this certainly doesn't mean that the franchise can't grow into one that features an engaging story, but the execution here is still as schlocky as it ever was. The inconsequential plot and samey gameplay makes Syphon Filter 3 a tougher proposition to stomach, especially having just played the first two games back to back. With that said, I still played the game through to completion, which has to stand for something, right? Right? Despite the slightly tired nature of the game itself, you'll be glad to hear that it's another resounding success for the series on Steam Deck. As always, we're running the game via SteamOS by way of DuckStation, and yeah, it's another perfect result. The game's audio, its visuals, mechanics, the whole package is reproduced here to a T. All of the praise I've levelled at the franchise on deck thus far is once again applicable to Syphon Filter 3. Given that the game cranks the difficulty up another couple of notches above its forebears, the presence of save states really makes the game easier to stomach on deck than it otherwise would be on real hardware. I know that this is the third time I've mentioned how great save states are, news to no one, I'm sure, but being able to sand down the oft spiky difficulty of older games by manually adding these checkpoints, it's modern convenience at its finest. So, once again we've got perfect visuals, excellent audio, responsive controls and flawless performance. Syphon Filter 3 hands in the episode's third 10 out of 10 compatibility rating on Steam Deck. So far we're 3 for 3, but how long can we keep that going? With 3 games now in the bag and a household franchise to their name, Bend Studios' next project would be a transformative new take on the Syphon Filter franchise for the PlayStation 2. Released in 2004, Syphon Filter The Omega Strain sought to bring the historically single-player series into the nascent online webscape of the future. It's the Syphon Filter that you know and maybe love, but now it's in co-op. I do really want to give credit to Bend for being so ambitious with their core concept here. Instead of leaning once again on Gabe Logan and his revolving team of spy mates, you instead create your own character, level them up, and kit them out to your liking over the course of the campaign. Mechanically, the game is tighter than it was on the original PlayStation, albeit with the caveat that the kind of heavy, swoopy, inertia-led movement looks a little sillier at twice the resolution. Aside from a notably unique push toward player individuality and a customizable experience, the main crux of the game is its multiplayer component, which really seeks to shake up the formula. It's rather unfortunate then that this multiplayer focus is one of the Omega Strain's weaker elements. John Garvin, the then head of Bend Studio, touched upon this game in an interview from 2007, where he revealed that this particular Syphon Filter game was never meant to have a single player mode at all, and that they were forced to cobble one together at the 11th hour. The original plan was to go all in on co-op and to offer no alternative for those who hadn't yet navigated the shit show that was getting your PS2 online. DNAS, anyone? This one foot in, one foot out approach is awkwardly prominent throughout the game's campaign. Playing it in single player and you're routinely confronted with co-op exclusive sections and mechanics that you simply have no way of engaging with. Playing it in co-op and well, I couldn't. It's 2024, end of story. As a single player game, it feels messy and it lacks the taut pacing of earlier entries. Enemies respawn now, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, especially when you consider that certain objectives will remain completed if you die, even though all of the baddies get reincarnated. I think a lot of these shortcomings could have been evaded if the narrative or the game setting wasn't more hokum nonsense. Despite the fact that you get sent on another whistle-stop tour of global hot zones, it's underwhelming to be sent all the way to Japan only to spend half of your time in an underground car park. It's grounded, sure, but in an NCIS way and not in a cool kind of a Max Payne way. Alright, look, I think we've boxed the head off of the Omega Strain to a satisfactory level. How does it actually run on the deck? As we're playing our first PS2 game of the episode, DuckStation has been relieved of its emulation duties and in steps a shiny new version of PCSX2, our stalwart PS2 emulator. Given that it's been categorically ages since I made one of these videos, PCSX2 has actually undergone some significant updates that I haven't yet touched upon. I'll be doing a dedicated video on that soon, but for now, the Omega Strain. What's the story? Well, I mean, it's actually fine. There are some minor frame drops here and there as data is loaded in off of the SSD, but audio, controls and visuals all seem to shape up nicely on the deck. You might notice that the frame time in the upper left hand corner is going absolutely bonkers. However, I think that's more to do with the game running at 30 FPS within a 60 FPS container than it is to do with any sort of actual instability. Frame pacing is actually quite steady in this instance, so it's nothing to worry about. It could also be Vulkan, which is new to this version of PCSX2, but again, it's fine. Any of the outstanding issues listed on the game's entry over on PCSX2's wiki have already been solved with recent updates, so you shouldn't face any major compatibility hurdles playing the game on deck. So it doesn't quite reach the home run levels that the older Syphon Filter games achieved through DuckStation, but it's as close as we're likely to get emulating PS2 games in current year. Some minor frame drops are really the only discernible issue here, which means I can comfortably rate Syphon Filter the Omega Strain's compatibility at a co-op-tastic 9 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Following the less than stellar critical response to the Omega Strain's wonky co-op antics, Bend Studios' next Syphon Filter game would take the series back to its formative roots. Instead of forcing you to play online as a create-a-sleuth no-mark, Syphon Filter Dark Mirror would once again cast the player as Gabe Logan and his good pal Leanne as they put the kibosh on some terrorist capers. Releasing in 2006 for the PSP and 1 year later in a compromised form for the PlayStation 2, Dark Mirror served as an early standout for Sony's first dedicated handheld. Critics and fans alike were totally enamoured with how Bend had broken the franchise back down to its base elements before building it up again as this tight, concise handheld adventure. Missions in the game are short, but the pace is still breakneck. There are a whole bunch of gadgets and abilities to play with, and you're routinely tasked with using them creatively in order to solve, say, an environmental puzzle or a set piece or a boss fight. Now, personally, I didn't actually play Dark Mirror at the time, but I can easily see now why it was so beloved. It's brilliant. Oftentimes, I'll elect to kind of suspend my disbelief and almost pretend I'm playing a game at the time of its release in order to assess it in context. I don't really feel the need to do that here. Dark Mirror is still fun, it's still engaging. It's got a kind of a humour to it, you know, enemies ragged all around the place as you punch them in the head or remote detonate an explosive dart up their backpipe. It's just good, clean fun. In addition, it slows down the narrative to a point where it's actually a touch more coherent than the franchise typically is. It's silly and over the top as always, but you're given more time to digest its ins and outs, which is a massive plus over prior games in the franchise. If you only play one game featured in this video, I really do recommend making it this one. Gleaming recommendation aside then, what's the best way to go about actually playing the thing? We're starting off with the PSP version of the game running within PPSSPP via SteamOS. The first thing you're likely to notice when you boot into the game is how crisp and responsive the controls feel. This is in spite of the fact that you're relying on the face buttons in order to rotate Gabe in an exclusively cardinal manner. No diagonals here, folks. Adding the right analog stick as a secondary set of face button inputs within PPSSPP is an easy and quick improvement on these controls. With that said though, it really is fine out of the box. Performance is capped, remarkably, at 60 FPS, and what's even more surprising is that it hits this target most of the time. As soon as the screen really starts to fill up with baddies, you'll notice a stark drop down to 30 FPS, but this behaviour is baked into the game's own VSync solution and doesn't stem from the emulator itself. Audio and visual effects are all present and accounted for, however I did notice that on occasion you'd see lights in the environment cutting through level geometry. This is an issue that tends to pop up quite frequently in PPSSPP, and whilst it doesn't severely dampen the experience, it does blemish an otherwise solid output. Thanks to Dark Mirror's PSP port being the lead version of the game, PPSSPP's maturity as an emulator, and the Steam Deck's overall grunt, this is an easy recommendation to make. Some minor lighting related impairments are mitigated by solid performance, crisp visuals, and responsive controls. Dark Mirror's PSP port therefore scores a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10. The other version of Dark Mirror we have to sink our teeth into is the PS2 port, which you're now looking at running within PCSX2. Initial impressions here are strong, really strong in fact. The overall fidelity of the game's visuals and audio are a noticeable step above the PSP version of the game. In addition, Dark Mirror's migration to a home console brought with it true dual analog controls. So far so good, right? Well, the devil is in the detail, and sadly the PS2 version of the game is nerfed beyond belief. Violence and swearing is out, yep, you heard me. Certain sections of the game have been made shorter and easier. The audio within cutscenes tends to fall out of sync with the video. There's no built-in widescreen. Honestly, the list goes on. The cuts made to the game's content would already be enough for me to sideline this port in favour of the PSP version, but PCSX2's compatibility here also leaves a lot to be desired. The frame rate is very shaky, and coupled with the emulator's higher overall level of latency compared to its contemporaries, combat is rendered frustratingly awkward. Lining up headshots in particular is an absolute pain. It's a shame that not only has this version of the game been made rubbish at source, but that PCSX2 can't really paper over these chasms on Steam Deck. Despite the game's clean visuals, wobbly performance and high input latency ruin the day. The PS2 version of Syphon Filter Dark Mirror scores a 7 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. It should come as no surprise that Dark Mirror's PSP port scores the seal of approval next to its PS2 brother. If you really want higher quality textures, character models and audio, then have a little look at the game on PS2. Just be aware that you're getting less stuff for your time and all at a much shakier frame rate. Riding high on the massive success that was Dark Mirror, it would only take Bend Studio 1 year to push out a sequel to the game, once again targeting the PSP as its lead platform. Syphon Filter, Logan's Shadow, was released in late 2007 and aimed to iterate on its predecessor as opposed to reinvent the series from the ground up. A port for the PlayStation 2 would arrive all the way down the road in 2010, exclusively in the US. What? Mechanically, Logan's Shadow is broadly similar to Dark Mirror, with a couple of key switcheroos. You can no longer light enemies on fire using your taser, which up until now was one of Syphon Filter's more unique little touches. How sadistic does that sound? Outside of that, lock-on auto-aim has been abolished in favour of a traditional third-person free aim, and you can now dive underwater for some Thunderball-esque spear gun shenanigans. I will argue that the Syphon Filter formula present in Dark Mirror is a little bit less fun the second time around in Logan's Shadow. This game's missions are all a little bit longer than before, set pieces have a tendency to outstay their welcome sometimes, and the very era-appropriate inclusion of QuickTime events doesn't do much to assist with immersion. The narrative attempts to weave a more personal yarn, centering on Gabe and his partner Leanne, but it's completely ridiculous. It's impossible to take these characters seriously. Dark Mirror embraced the humour associated with how over the top this series is, whereas Logan's Shadow takes itself far too seriously. Don't get me wrong, it's still quite a good game, but Dark Mirror does just about everything Logan's Shadow does, albeit with far better pacing and direction. If this game's predecessor didn't exist, I'd be telling you to play Logan's Shadow, but it does exist, so proceed with caution. Play this one second, as you probably will anyway because it's a sequel. Right, let's say you do want to play the game on deck. What's the best way to go about doing that? Well, the first version we're taking a look at is the PSP port, running once again via PPSSPP within Steam OS. Technically, this was another true showcase of Sony's little handheld that could. We've got smoke effects, dynamic water ripples, physics objects in the environment, funny ragdolls. The benefits of tenured developers working within their own game engine are clear within Logan's Shadow. As a result of all of these bespoke effects, this entry is a touch more demanding than its predecessor, particularly when it comes to reproducing all of those fancy visual treats. The aforementioned trouble PPSSPP tends to have with complex lighting effects manifests itself in abundance here. Lights are often seen cutting through level geometry, the titular shadows are oddly selective about what objects they do and don't cloak in darkness, and smoke effects in particular certainly aren't billowing as Bend Studio intended. On the upside, performance is actually very solid and is a touch more consistent than it was in Dark Mirror, despite the visual upgrades. Even when the screen starts filling up with rent-a-bozos, the controller response and frame times keep their head firmly above water. The lack of an auto-aim mechanic in Logan's Shadow means that this is a very welcome outcome, and lining up dome blasters is as easy as can be. There's nothing outlandish to report regarding audio, we've no crackling or stuttering thankfully, so no news is definitely good news. On the whole, Logan's Shadow is a decidedly more mixed experience within PPSSPP. Performance, controls and audio are fine, however the game's reliance on high fidelity visuals and the emulator's difficulty in relaying them has a definite impact on the overall experience. Logan's Shadow on the PSP scores a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10 on Steam Deck. It would take an astonishing 3 whole years for Sony to realise that they actually had forgotten to port Logan's Shadow to the PS2. Oops. In 2010, the media giant squared away that oversight and bolstered the PS2's autumnal period with Gabe's Final Adventure. We're playing that version of the game right here, right now via PC SX2, and as a complete product, it's a far closer match to its PSP forebear than Dark Mirror's home console version. With the exception of the game's wireless multiplayer mode, we're not subjected to any major content cuts this time around. Visually, the game is a nice jump over the PSP port, although the audio quality is rougher across the board, especially when it comes to Gabe's voice lines. Another weird quirk is this version's lack of physics-enabled clutter in its levels. Enemy ragdolls still bounce around the place, but every crate and storage unit has been firmly superglued to the ground in this timeline. Every aspect I've mentioned so far is replicated on the deck via emulation with no issues. In addition, the game's inclusion of a native widescreen mode means we can immerse ourselves even further in Logan's swan song. Where this port falls short is its performance, which is much rougher than PPSSPP's resilient 60 FPS lock. PCSX2 has a much harder time maintaining a decent frame rate on deck, and the experience is compromised to a degree as a result. Setting the port's unstable performance when emulated to the side for a moment, Logan's Shadow actually shapes up pretty well on deck. The game's visuals, its audio, the feel of the controls, everything else is absolutely fine. Taking the rough with the smooth in this instance, it's just the frequent and deep frame rate spikes that lower the overall compatibility score. Syphon Filter Logan's Shadow scores a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10 on deck. Look, I know this is a bit of a jip, and these videos are meant to be somewhat definitive, but when it comes to playing Logan's Shadow on the deck, it really is a matter of personal preference. Do you value performance over all else? Then go for the PSP version via PPSSPP. If a solid visual output is more your bag, then PCSX2 is the way to go. Either way, both ports offer a good but not great experience on the deck. Common knowledge would have us believe that Logan's Shadow was the final game released under the Syphon Filter umbrella. As it turns out, there was actually one more PSP exclusive game in the series put out by Bend Studio. Just a few short months after Logan's Shadow was launched, Syphon Filter Combat Ops was unceremoniously hoisted onto the PSN with very little fanfare. Seriously, this game is teetering on the brink of being lost media. The trailer you're currently watching didn't even come from an official source. It was instead uploaded 14 years ago by an account named Maxi Effects. The Wikipedia entry for the entire franchise doesn't even mention Combat Ops either. So what is it? Well, as you can likely tell, it's a fleshed out version of the multiplayer component that was found in both Logan's Shadow and Dark Mirror. I can tell you right now, if I'd had my PSP online when Combat Ops was around, I would have been all over it. The absolute hum of early online jank off of this game and this trailer, it's totally up my street. I really miss when games like this were prevalent, weird little experiments that didn't have to set the world on fire in order to be deemed a success. This totally self-contained little multiplayer package was safely nestled away with its community on the PSP's PSN store, and I was totally none the wiser. It was around this time that Sony was playing catch-up with Microsoft's early successes in the online multiplayer space. Hungry to make an imprint, I seem to remember a bunch of these fleshed-out little diversions and ports circulating on the PSP. Good times with a great console. Can we relive some of those memories on what you could argue is a successor to Sony's PSP? In short, not really. In terms of base compatibility, PPSSPP presents the same kind of experience it did with Logan's Shadow, in that we've got very solid performance, but slightly wonky visual and lighting effects. I was able to jump into the combat modifier mode and start putting together my own map layout using the game's admittedly quite intuitive creation system. The real issue is that this is just about all I can do in Syphon Filter Combat Ops. Thanks to the game's servers being a long-distant memory, the online functionality that underpinned this entire game is completely inaccessible via emulation. I did try to start an ad hoc match using the emulator's built-in mimicry of the PSP's local network, but that just froze the entire game up. Boo! With all of these caveats, Combat Ops ends up feeling like a sad, empty vessel. It's a bit unfortunate that it's a frighteningly on-the-nose reflection of how Syphon Filter exists as a franchise in the here and now. Given the visual issues and most of the game's functionality being lost to time, Syphon Filter Combat Ops scores a compatibility rating of 4 out of 10 on Steam Deck. And there we go, every single Syphon Filter title reviewed and tested on Steam Deck. After working on the series for over a decade, Bend Studio would go on to develop excellent handheld entries in both the Resistance and Uncharted franchises. Their next attempt at home console development would bring us Days Gone, a game that I absolutely love and have covered on the channel before. Bend intended on sticking with Days Gone as a series, however, their pitch for a multiplayer-focused sequel was turned down by Sony, who themselves counter-pitched a reboot of the Syphon Filter franchise. Feeling burned out by the whole affair, it was at this point that the studio's creative leads moved on, leaving behind the studio they'd founded all those years ago. That's all a bit sad, isn't it? I won't stay on the topic or else I'll start ranting. So, I'll thank you for watching, and I'll humbly ask you to tune in next time where we'll be joining the coolest club in town. See ya!